Okay, so welcome back. Yesterday, I wanted to give you names of 4 individuals that I felt were representative of progressive educational ideas of the various centuries that they came from. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Horace Mann, John Dewey, and today we'll cover a man named William Ayres. I did want to cover one thing that I failed to mention yesterday, and this is in regards to Horace Mann and Luther and state education. I think this is very important for us to kind of have an answer to this. If you read information on education essays and such from the synodical school boards and essays and educators and professors and stuff in the 20th century, oftentimes you'll get this dogmatic statement that Luther said the state should rule education, so therefore we're going along with everything that the government says in terms of certification and accreditation and curriculum. As good citizens, we're going to follow Luther and obey the state. I think that we need to have an answer for that because that is a false statement in terms of applying it to the American situation. Luther's situation in Reformation Germany was that, of course, the Roman Church was not going to help him in the Reformation. So he went to his allies, which were the German princes, and encouraged them to help him educate the German people in the Word of God and in the various sciences and the classical arts. What happened in Germany over 200 or 300 years with the government abandoning the Word of God, and then you get the Prussian education system, or you get Nazism, and Luther gets blamed for that, really is not even fair. And it's certainly not right to apply that kind of broad comment that, Luther was one of the government to run education to the United States. What Luther said about education was, where the Holy Scriptures are not the rule, I advise no man to send his child. You guys are all familiar with that quote. The schools as they are today in the United States, the government schools, would not be schools that Luther would be encouraging us to send our children to. So when people throw out that thing, Luther says that, we have to, government education. No, let's answer that right away. Education is not neutral. It can never be. It is not just like an invention of, technology or something that can be used for good or evil. It is not a neutral thing because it is based on philosophy and questions such as who is man, what are we here for, why do we educate, what our goals are. These are all spiritual and theological, philosophical matters, and they are not neutral. So progressive education and classical Lutheran education, classical education are diametrically opposed. They are enemies, and we've got to not look at it as though we can live happily under one big tent, and it's just a matter of choice of what you want to be. You want to be a classical or you want to be a progressive. We're still going to all be one big happy family. How has that worked in terms of worship style? Has that worked for us in that? I don't think so. It really doesn't work in education either. We really haven't grasped that, I don't think. Okay. Let's go on with our last man on the list, William Ayres. Some of you may be familiar with his name, some of you may not. I picked him not because I think he is going to be the seminal educator that is remembered of the 21st century. I see him as just representative of what we have today in the current educational government system in the United States under the Obama administration, and it's coming through Common Core, and I see him as representative of that. So I'm not really putting him on the plane of Dewey and Mann as being influential over an entire century. But nevertheless, I think he is representative, very much so, of the postmodern education that we do have today being promoted by our federal government, and our Lutheran schools are picking up on it and just adopting it. So let's go with him. By the way, these educational ideas sheets that are in your packet, it might be good for you to separate those and put all those out in front together, because we're going to talk about some of those maybe in a group later on. Okay, follow along with your outline. William Charles Ayres was born 26th of December 1944, Oak Park, Illinois, a nice suburb of Illinois, of Chicago. His parents were Thomas G. Ayres and Mary Ayres. He was the third of 5 children. His father was quite prominent. He's the president of Con Edison Company, so they had quite a bit of money. Not much has been published about his religious background, and I will admit I have not read every one of the books that he has written, so he may have revealed some things about that I am not aware of. But it is known that his parents were members of a congregational church in the Chicago suburban area. They had their funerals there, and they were active in the church. So we can assume that the family, the parents were active in this church. The family had some exposure to Christianity of that stripe. His mom was a homemaker. She was very active in many social clubs, and she was known to be an expert ornithologist, kind of an armchair expert ornithologist. So he had quite a wealthy background. He went to public schools his early years until he was a sophomore, when he was transferred to the Lake Forest Academy, which is a very elite prep school in the Chicago area. And in 1963, he entered the University of Michigan. Immediately became wrapped up in the radicalism of the age, student protests, things like that. Increasingly became an agitator on campus. He was arrested, went to jail for about 10 days for disrupting a draft board office, and he decided that he would drop out of school for a while and went to teach at what we call, it was kind of a Summerhill type school. It was a progressive school, and he went there, alternative school, and he went there to teach early childhood education. Then he returned to Ann Arbor, becoming involved in the Students for a Democratic Society, which was a radical terrorist type group. He found that group too tame, and with other friends he founded what's called the Weathermen, later called the Weather Underground, which was a communist group that was dedicated to the revolutionary overthrow of the United States by violent means. He racked up a whole career of domestic terrorism. The Weathermen were responsible for bombings at Fort Dix, New Jersey, the New York City Police Headquarters, the Capitol, the Pentagon. These are things that happened before most of us really, I don't think there's anybody here that maybe really remembers them too well. You're probably young, you guys in the back. The rest of us just here. I'm sorry. Actually, you're not that much older than me. So anyway, Ayers was very active in this whole student uprising of the 1960s. He was on the FBI's most wanted list for over 10 years, went underground with his lover partner Bernadine Dorn. They came out from the underground, and when he was released on a technicality, evidently the government didn't have a proper warrant for one of the things he was surveillance tapes or something. So he was totally let off, and he's been quoted as saying, guilty as hell, free as a bird. Okay, what did he do after he came out of this? Decided that he was going to change his tactics, follow Dewey in a way, and instead of transforming America by revolution, he would do it by evolution via education. He would mentor future radicals. He attended the progressive Bank Street College in New York City, which is kind of a night school for people who want education degrees. His dad was a trustee on this school board. This is why a felon or a fugitive can get into college with your dad's on the board. He received his Master's of Education there, and then he immediately went into Columbia University to get his education doctorate in curriculum. As soon as he got out of Columbia, he was immediately hired at the University of Chicago, Illinois as a professor, moved to Hyde Park, an exclusive area, and he retained that position as a professor for over 20 years, very influential in teaching and mentoring young students in progressive methods of education. While he was a professor, just like Dewey, he racked up a whole list of left-wing organizations and such that he was, political groups and such that he was a part of. I'll list some of these. They might be in your outline too. 1994, the Committees of Correspondence, which was an offshoot of the Communist Party USA. He was a founder, along with known communist Mike Klonsky, with the Small Schools Movement. And what the Small Schools Movement was, it wasn't about promoting small schools, okay? What it was about using your influence in your school, wherever you are, to promote activist left-wing causes, such as racial inequality, social justice, the anti-war movement, and things like that. 1995, Ayers became a part of what was called the CAC, the Chicago Annenberg Challenge. Over the years, this organization funded over $100 million to radical left-wing organizations in the United States, such as Acorn and other alternative schools that promoted this type of thing. They called them schools of resistance, is what they called them. In 1997, Ayers was named Chicago's Citizen of the Year by Mayor Daley for his work with the CAC. One of the things that you may have heard of this guy for was that he became prominent in the political election of Barack Obama because he hosted the first famous fundraiser campaign that launched the political career of Barack Obama in 1995. And he worked with a man for about 3 or 4 years on another fund called the Woods Fund. They even shared an office for a while. Anyway, Ayers took over the chairmanship, and they also were funding a lot of money to left-wing causes in schools. Okay, after the 1990s, Ayers, again, maybe this is something that just happens to you, I don't know, if you become involved in these left-wing causes, but like Dewey, who wanted to expand from nationalism to internationalism, Ayers did the same thing, and he started getting involved in international political affairs, such as the Miranda International Center in Venezuela, which was a Hugo Chavez government think tank, and their goal was to bring Castro-style education to Venezuela. He helped with that. In 2009, he was active in several anti-Israel organizations. He served on the Committee for a Just Peace in Israel and Palestine, along with Jeremiah Wright, the Free Gaza Group, and the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. In 2010, he joined the board, editorial board for In These Times, which is a Chicago-based socialist journal, and he was retired from the university as a distinguished professor. Kind of an interesting story about this distinguished professor stuff. The University of Chicago at Illinois wanted to honor him further, and I'm not quite sure what the title was, but it was some kind of distinguished emeritus professor, and then he would get a stipend for life for having this honor. One of the Robert Kennedy's sons intervened in that and was able to stop that because Ayers was on record as having in one of his books, Prairie Fires, it was dedicated to many terrorists, including Sirhan Sirhan, the man that assassinated Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, Attorney General, and such. So he was, the Kennedy guy stopped this. It's interesting, isn't it, that the university would want to do that, would want to honor people like that. Anyway, such it is. Proceeding on to more recent things, after he retired from the university, that freed him up to go back into more activist activities in politics. He was a leader in 2011 of the Occupy Wall Street, and on October 19th, 2011, he was a keynote speaker for the Occupy Chicago teachers strike, if you remember that in the news. Since then, he has been a very well-paid and highly sought-after speaker at universities and for many radical organizations. He's authored many books, and these are used in schools of education today all over the place. Lots of papers on revolutionary activism and radical progressive education. And I'll list some of them. Just listen to the titles. Some of them you may have on the outline. They kind of give a clue as to where he's coming from. Public Enemy, Confessions of an American Dissident, Promoting Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance, Critical Factors for Success in the 21st Century. That's a 2013 Common Core document, okay? And believe me, when he says grit, tenacity, and perseverance, he's not talking about hard work and education. It has a totally different meaning if you ever read this document. But anyway, he's connected indirectly and directly with the Common Core curriculum. Race Course Against White Supremacy, Teaching the Taboo, Courage and Imagination in the Classroom, Justice in Education, Fugitive Days, Teaching the Personal and Political, On the Side of the Child, Summerhill Revisited, Zero Tolerance, Resisting the Drive for Punishment, and so on and so forth. He has worked closely with the Obama administration officials, Arne Duncan, who is Secretary of Education now, and Linda Darling Hammond, who is part of Common Core. Yes?
I come from Chicago and knew about Bill Ayers during the riots. Like you say, his dad was he was the president of Commonwealth Edison, They lived in a wealthy suburb. Billy Ayers was involved with the violent riots of Weather Underground in Chicago. The thing you need to know about Bill Ayers is he is the political mentor of Barack Obama. In fact, he ghost wrote Barack Obama's autobiography, Created by My Father.
He's admitted that, too.
Yes. And if you want to find the common denominator between Bill Ayers, Barack Obama, and Hillary Rodham grew up a few miles from where I grew up. She grew up in a suburb, a wealthy suburb, Park Ridge, in Chicago. Who radicalized these? Who was their mentor?
Their pastor, wasn't it?
No, the name was a guy named Saul Alinsky.
Oh, yeah.
Alinsky, a book called Rules for Radicals. He is the guru of radicalism in Chicago that influenced Hillary Clinton, Billy Ayers, and Barack Obama.
Thank you. Those connections are there with all these guys. And if you look back on people like Dewey and Mann, you also see these same connections with the radical elite. They're friends. They're fellow travelers. Thank you, Pastor, for that. One thing I want to introduce to you here, I think you'll find this very interesting about Bill Ayers. After he retired, this is a book that was just produced in 2014. It's called Diving In, Bill Ayers and the Art of Teaching into the Contradiction. It's a very typical progressive educator's book, and what they are like is they're just a series of essays where people talk about themselves and what they've done, and mostly on radical political activities and such, and they tie it in teaching and influencing children and everything. So this is a book in honor of him, in honor of his retirement, I should say, from the University of Chicago at Illinois. It is edited by Isabella Nunez, Associate Professor at Concordia University, Chicago. She is on staff there, and she is also a part of some of these radical groups that Ayers was. I believe that he mentored her, I think, based on the years that you look at. So let's not think that these things are just far away and they're not going to affect us. They will. People influence people. Okay, let's stop with these guys and let's move on to...
Quick quote
Yes.
for you. This is from Saul Stern concerning Bill Ayers.
Okay.
Calling Bill Ayers a school reformer is a bit like calling Joseph Stalin an agricultural worker.
Thank you. 1992, we had a presidential election. Most of us were around for that. And each of the candidates, they picked a theme song for their candidacy. And I think this year, 1992 was just brilliant in terms of really these theme songs expressing the progressive versus the conservative viewpoint. One of the candidates was incumbent President George H.W. Bush, and his theme song was God Bless the USA, I'm proud to be an American because at least I know I'm free. How does it go? And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me, so let's stand up and defend her. God bless the USA. Okay. The opponent was William Jefferson Clinton. His theme song was Fleetwood Mac's Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. This is a perfect example of progressivism. If you don't understand it really in terms of education, think about that song. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow. Don't stop, it'll soon be here. Everything's better than before. Yesterday's gone, yesterday's gone. So we have those two songs. I think if you don't get anything about progressive education and classical education, think of those two songs and think of the philosophy that they're teaching, and it really expresses it well. In view of that, look at this chart. I tried to kind of differentiate progressive and classical techniques or methodologies of teaching so that you could see the opposite, and I will admit this thing needs some tweaking. It's not perfect, so bear with me on that. It's not an exhaustive list as I've typed out here. It's intended to shed light on the fundamental incompatibility of progressive education with our traditional Lutheran understanding of schools, their purpose, and their operations. Obviously, not all points are going to be evident in every school. However, the current state of Lutheran education at all levels demonstrates that even self-described classical Lutheran schools may reflect progressive influence. So I want you to use this as kind of a mirror to yourself, and a mirror to your own teaching, and a mirror to your school, church, whatever, and see, do we see these things seeping in here or not? Some of them you may, some of them you may not. So let's look at some of them. They're roughly separated into philosophy, methodology, and curriculum. This isn't a perfect delineation, but it'll serve our purposes. Progressive education is based on atheism. There is no God. There is nothing beyond this world. And so if there's nothing beyond this world, what are we trying to do? We're going to create a utopia on earth, okay, right? That's what we do. Classical Lutheran is a theistic-based education. We believe in God. One of the next, I'm going to go through not all of these, but some of these. Evolution is another plank of progressive education. You can't really, and I don't mean just in the sciences, but as we see time, progressive education, by nature of the word, the root word progress, it sees life and sees our life on earth as one ramp, that we're going up. Everything's getting better. Okay? As a Christian, we don't see time that way. We see time as linear. We have God in eternity before time began. God created time. We have the creation of the world. We have Christ who came to redeem the world, and Christ will return again, and from that point on, then eternity will continue. Very, very different views of time. So you'll also get with progressive education some cyclical views of time. The reincarnation ideas will come out in some of the curriculum that way. I don't think those two things are issues for us as classical Lutheran educators. We understand that. But you need to understand that that's their basis when you look at their writings and their methods they want you to teach by. Okay? Next one, how does a progressive educator, a true progressive educator at heart, and a Christian classical educator view man? Man is good, according to a progressive educator. Classical Lutheran educator, we know that man is depraved, we are sinners in need of a Savior. Next one is, and you can stop me on some of these. I think some of these are pretty self-evident, but if not, raise your hand, please. Child-centered or society-centered education, that, Dewey said, why did they put this moniker of child-centered education on me? I'm all about society and collectivism, and he called it democracy, but what it was just kind of a socialism. That was what he advocated. But we wouldn't, either way, that's an emphasis on man, isn't it? It's not an emphasis on Christ, on God, or the Word of God. Even if we look not so much at our own Lutheran heritage from the Reformation, but we look back in the Puritan heritage, of America. What do we have? 1647, the old Luther-Satan law. That was the Massachusetts law that said because Satan has kept the Word of God locked in foreign tongues, it is necessary for us to teach our children to read so they can read the Word of God on their own. That's part of our American heritage. Where the Word of God is central to education. Progressive education has totally thrown that out. And then, have any of you heard of the theory of multiple intelligence? Okay, most of you have, yes. If you went through education school, you have. 20 years ago or so, that used to be considered kind of cutting-edge theory, If you look at course catalogs in our Concordias now and you read the descriptions of the classes that our students take, they have accepted that as dogma, as fact, okay? And what that says is our job as teachers is to educate the quote-unquote whole child. We've heard that a lot. And that means our job is not just to deal with the intellect and the mind and the soul, but we have to encompass everything for the child. Not only that, we understand that intelligence, we redefine it, according to the progressive educators, as not just the mental or intellectual capacity of a child, but you have an intelligence in music, or you have an intelligence in being compassionate to people, whatever they are, physical, athletic, you name it. Instead of just calling what we call them God-given talents in certain areas, it's been redefined as intelligence, and therefore is the responsibility of the school to teach all these things. So what is the end result of all that? Think about it. If you're teaching all these things, and you're responsible for everything from the health of the child to, you name it, their physical, their musical, how much time is left to teach academics? Nothing, And this is a progressive idea. There's no time left for any of this stuff. Yes?
I just wanted to point out just kind of a connection. A lot of these theories that drove practice were discovered, I guess, in lab school. And so just thinking about the manifestation of the evolutionary worldview, that people are lab rats.
Yes.
Children are lab rats.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can put them in these boxes and observe them, and then we create our theory from that. And so just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. And actually, I should have said more about that, talking about John Dewey, because that was what he saw, is that we're always evolving and we're always changing, and so we'll try this for a while and see how long it works, then we'll try something else, and then we'll observe and we'll make records, and then we'll try a new program. Public school teachers actually complain a lot about that, how they're constantly being thrown these new curricula, and they have to do it. Well, that's all part of what you said. This children are lab rats. We're going to try these things out on them. Interesting. Any of you guys graduate from the Seward High School, the Lutheran Seward High School, before it was disbanded in 1972? My husband did. They renamed that school. It was originally one of the prep schools, and my husband's diploma is Concordia Secondary Laboratory School. So even back in the 70s, they had gone over to this lab school stuff.
Because in the public school, call us the lab rat.
Yeah. Okay, I better move on or we won't get through this. Reconstruction of society, this was Dewey's thing. If we're going to change society, we've got to do it through the education process. Politically, it takes too long. It just takes too long to change society, but we can do it. We get to the kids and we change their attitudes. As a Christian, we are training our kids to live their lives in two kingdoms. We're training them for eternity in their faith, and we're also training them to live their Christian vocation here on earth, to serve their neighbor. Next one, state institution and authority over the child in the school versus the in loco parentis in Acts 5:29. One of the things I think was really, really well written about that, and you find it buried in the Rolf Preuss website, in one of his articles actually about the Synodical Conference. But he talks about this issue of, where does our authority come in teaching children? Does it come because the state gives us authority over the children? Is it because the church has authority over the children, or does it stem from the parents? And he makes a very good case. It's from the parents. When Bill and I lived in Canada, I would get a check every year at the end of the year. And it was my check from the federal government for taking care of their children. The children were considered to be, I was the mother and the state was the father. That was the way the government was set up. Even though we were married and such, I got this check from our tax refund for caring for, they saw the children as property of the state. That was,
my name was not on it.
It wasn't, no. I guess I was married to the state, right? Progressive education can be, for all its talk about being, open and free, it's very legalistic. I put it this way, it's very legalistic in terms of man's laws and very antinomian in terms of God's law. And I think we can slip into that too, can't we, in our church body? We're more interested in synodical bylaws than we are in what the Bible says or what the Lutheran confessions or something say. We can slip into that very easily. You've got to watch for that. As a Christian classical school, we want to be focused on the gospel in the Word of God. Proper distinction between law and gospel. And I guess Pastor Kane's class is running concurrently right now, so you're missing the law and gospel presentation, but that's explained very well there. Socialism is the politics of progressive education. Conservative view would be we have liberty, we have freedom in the gospel, can be applied both politically and theologically. We check the time, half an hour or so. All right. Next page, teacher autonomy versus teacher accountability. As a student at Seward, that was something that was constantly drummed into me and us. You are autonomous in your classroom. Don't let some dumb hick school board tell you what you have to do. You are the professional. And really what that is, the judges, every man does what is right in his own eyes. And that's what it was. Okay. A classical school will have teacher accountability. And as I put down here lower, I think that accountability comes strongly out if you have a curriculum guide. But we'll get to that later. Progressive education, I think especially under Horace Mann, definitely wanted diversity of students. We want all the diverse students all under one roof, but we don't want diversity of schools. And as a classical educator, we would say we would like parents and churches and all sorts of institutions to take responsibility and start good schools for their children and let them fit your situation. Locally run, not some top-down entity. Okay. In terms of, this isn't on here, but I want to bring this one up. It's kind of under academic rigor. But one of the things that we have been often taught as a progressive educator is that we should teach to the middle because, we have low students, you have high students, so if you want to really get the most of them, teach to this big bell curve middle. Absolutely the opposite of what we want to do in classical education. We want every one of our students to be challenged. We don't want the smart kids to have to sit there and twiddle their thumbs and wait for everybody else to catch up. And we don't want children so frustrated that they can't learn. All of them should be challenged with difficult material. Okay, those are just some I guess you'd call philosophical broad ideas. Specific methodology, and please again, as you think about this methodology, remember that it stems from a philosophy of man, and that man is either good or man is a sinner that needs salvation. So what are the best ways for us to learn? Progressive education would say all knowledge is something that the child must construct. If they don't come up with it on their own, it's not authentic. You're just feeding facts and it doesn't have any meaning to them. It's all this constructivist notion of learning. As classical educators, we understand that we have a body of information, not only in the scriptures, but in the world that we want to impart to our children to help them learn and help them serve their neighbor with their own talents. And so it needs to be passed on from generation to generation. That's totally scriptural, that we pass on the information that we have. We ask our children to learn things by heart. That's another thing that's really bad about progressive education, is not learning things by heart. Let me use mathematics as an example. Dewey and thought of things like the math facts, the addition, subtraction, multiplication facts as lower order thinking skills. So let's just skip over those. You can use your calculator. You don't need to learn how to learn these things. Let's skip over these things and forget these lower order skills, and we'll do this high-level critical thinking. Well, I'm sorry, but a child cannot think critically until they have a large foundation of knowledge and experience to build upon, and hopefully have been taught some logic so that they can understand things properly. So this idea that somehow you can avoid the lower order thinking skills and go straight to this high-level critical thinking just simply doesn't work. Hands-on experiential learning was a Rousseau thing. He didn't like books either. Forget the books. Let's get out in the forest and let's gather leaves or whatever you're going to do. I think homeschoolers really have a tendency to fall into this because there's a lot of homeschool material that is very progressive, and it's very much emphasizes this discovery stuff. So it's kind of interesting as a homeschooler to go to these giant homeschool fairs, and you just have everything. You have traditional, you have classical, you have all sorts of pretty wild, progressive stuff, and there really isn't any guide to say which is which. So you need to kind of know what you're doing there when you go to these big fairs. How many of you have heard the term developmentally appropriate? Yes. That's a progressive term that basically retards the learning pace of children. A mother came in and her child was in 2nd grade and she had gotten B's on a report card and she couldn't read a thing and she was very worried, and she said, I've gone to the teacher, I don't understand what's going on, but she just says, well, she just isn't ready developmentally, she's doing fine, she'll pick it up. Well, how many 4th and 5th and 6th grade teachers are going to teach basic reading in their class? No, this developmentally appropriate thing is an excuse to really slow down the pace of learning for children. It sounds so sophisticated and, erudite, but it's not. Next one is the collectivist, cooperative, collaborative approach. I don't think I need to talk too much about that. It was a Dewey idea, and this is the philosophy behind it. He said, well, if our children are going to be ready to be part of this collectivist, democratic, work-together society where everybody's working together for the good of the community and not for selfish reasons for themselves, then they need to practice it. And the way they're going to need to practice it is they need to practice it, through school, 12 years of school, sitting in a collective group around a table, working on projects together or whatever. I used to tell my kids in my class, I'd say, when you stand before the Almighty God, your friends aren't going to be able to carry you along there, We see this kind of grading taken to the gross extremes, too, when you have group grading, those kind of things. I've even seen people who graded according to, like, typing. You had a collective group of typists, typing speed, and you took an average of these kids, an average of those, and that was your grade. So you could be the greatest typer in the world, and the average of your group was down too bad, you got a C. And the meaning behind that, and this was Dewey, it was John Dewey who said, okay, it is the responsibility of the group to bring everybody else up. So you put peer pressure on your friends to get in line. And actually the Soviets, that was one aspect of Dewey's philosophy when he went over to the Soviet Union and he taught them some of his progressive educational theories. They really ran with that one. If you read about Soviet education and how, it's a lot of peer pressure to go along, it's ratting on each other, that kind of thing. Kids would be in these rows, and if the third person in the row goofed up, the rest of them had to come, at them, like a pack of rats after them. They really, really developed that aspect of this collective group, collective grading. The group is responsible. Just another little anecdote about Dewey on that. When he was at the University of Michigan and he was a teacher, one of his methods was he would just create a packet of material of all the information that the kids had to learn. He'd give it to them at the beginning of the semester, and then during his lectures he would just, ramble. That was class. And so there was a lot of cheating that went on. It happened to be kind of a culture of cheating at that time in the University of Michigan, and it was becoming a problem at the school. And so Dewey wrote about it in the school paper, and one of the school publications, and he basically said this, and I don't have the exact quote with me, but he said, this is the fault of the good kids, because they are not exerting enough pressure on these cheaters to bring the culture back up. And he says, I'm not going to be a spy. So here's the authority who should be teaching these children, and they were children, right and wrong, at least setting some standards, and they're just saying, no, it's your fault, you good kids who aren't doing any cheating, it's your fault, because you have not brought these other kids in line. That was his child rearing policy. He implemented it in schools, and he exported it to other countries too. Academic rigor, I'm going to talk about that one a little more tomorrow, so we'll skip that. Constructivist, I kind of went over that one. Teacher is guide and facilitator instead of instructor. What's a little saying? How does it go? You want to be a guide on the side instead of a sage on the stage. Yes. It's interesting to walk around and visit other schools and you watch teachers. And I've seen this so many times, even in classical Lutheran schools, where the teaching method is kids just get an assignment, and then the teacher just walks around, and, if you raise your hand, then I'll help you. This is the guide on the side. I'm not going to intervene. I'm not going to do a lot of direct instruction. I'm just going to let you kind of work on your own, and then I'll help you if you need help. Might be fine for older kids. It's terrible for children at a young age that need to really be drilled in the basics, and you need to have a lot of back and forth with them, There's a guy named Joe Friedman about 15 years ago in Canada, and he was very distressed about the situation in the Canadian schools. He produced a video called Failing Grades, and it became kind of a sensation in Canada, and there was a lot of discussion about the poor Canadian schools, specifically North American schools, because they had a progressive curriculum. Anyway, he examined the curriculum of Canada, and he was noticing that what the kids were learning in 7th and 8th grade, in other countries, the Canadian kids weren't learning it until 11th and 12th grade. And that would be, also would see that situation in the United States. And he said, why? What's the problem here? And so he did all sorts of investigation, went over to China and went to Eastern Europe, examined their schools, tried to find out what's different about these schools and ours besides, the dumbed-down curriculum. And what he found, he surveyed these teachers, and over in China, the teacher says the most important characteristic that a teacher had to have was clarity. Canadian teachers said the most important characteristic for a teacher is sensitivity and compassion. Which one do you think we would choose in our Lutheran parochial schools? Yeah. So we wonder, I think this kind of stems from this whole progressive idea that psychology is your new theology. I think that's where it stems from. Anyway. Second or third from the bottom, special needs, mainstreaming for all. Back, I don't know, you don't even use that word mainstream anymore. It also, 20 years ago, that was like a really cutting edge idea. Do you really do that? Do you put a handicapped child in your school? What do you do? Today that is considered absolutely standard. Of course you do. If you don't, what are you called? You're not Christian, right? Yeah, you get that accusation. As a classical school, knowing, and I think Cheryl has demonstrated this better than anyone, that all children can benefit from a rigorous classical education, we also understand that not all children are going to function well in a large group setting in a rigorous school. Okay, so Cheryl probably would not have taken Michelle and plopped her in the local classical school and said, there, go for it. You need one-on-one with a lot of these children. They need special one-on-one. And so I would advise you, as this becomes more and more of an issue in public schools, anybody, we're all going to be in one big classroom. Have a policy on that and take each child individually, look at each situation one-on-one, and evaluate them. Yes, Cheryl, please.
Just sort of an update on that. The people who advocated mainstreaming back in the day are now saying that maybe it was not the best idea. And what we can do, though, in our classical schools, and we have models of this throughout the country, is create a school within a school with a classical curriculum. We have one now called the Simply Classical Special Needs Curriculum for Classical Christian Education. Create a school within a school so they still have that school culture. They still get to go to chapel with everyone. Do not deport them to the public school, but create a smaller classroom. Doesn't have to be anyone special to teach, just
just a teacher with a smaller group. Veritas Academy in North Carolina is doing this, Immaculata in Louisville. Other Christian schools are doing this. Our Lutheran schools can do that too.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. You look at, you take the child, you see what they're able to do, and work with that. So thank you for that. Dewey and Mann both said that, I'm skipping a little bit, Dewey and Mann both said that we want to have kids all together of the same age. And they should go from one class to the next, no matter what, you know. Reason being is you can control them better that way. You can control students better if you have kids all the same age, you've got this peer group pressure, than if you have a younger child with an older child. You just have a different social dynamic there. It was a method of social control, and it was also a method of masking the fact that you weren't teaching them, and you were pushing them on to the next level just so they could be with their friends and not lose their self-esteem or whatever, but mask the fact that they had not learned what they needed to learn. This lack of any kind of a curriculum guide surely leads into that, and I think that is something that as classical Christian schools, we really need to work on that. Curriculum guide is really key for you know what you want to teach at each level, and if I walk into your school as a mother, and I say, what are you teaching in the 4th grade? The administrator can pull it out and say, here. He doesn't say, here's the Saxon math book. He has this curriculum guide. You know exactly what your child is expected to learn that year, and then the teachers are held accountable to it. All children can learn these things. If you're a good teacher, they're going to learn it. I guess a good way of putting that is that you should have your own canon of knowledge for your school, a canon of knowledge, so you know what you're teaching. I mean, too often, this is really a problem, I think, even in our classical schools. We say, well, what's your curriculum? Well, we use the Spalding. You know? No, that's just a tool that you're using to teach phonics and reading, okay? Or math, you know, well, we use this book. Well, if your curriculum guide is nothing but the teacher's guide, then it's always changing every time you get a new book. You don't have consistency, and you don't have consistency from one level to the next. That's a whole issue for an entire session, I think, the curriculum guide, but I'll move on from there. Automatic promotion, I think, is another flaw, maybe, or weakness that we see even still in our classical schools, because we don't want to fail somebody. Their parents are going to get upset or whatever, or they're going to feel bad, or they're, you know, more likely what will happen is they'll just pull their kids out of their school, you know. Well, if I'm going to fail, I'll just go to public school. They'll take me in the 6th grade. You know, we're afraid of that, you know, but it's like afraid of having standards. Come on. How many of you, here's a question to skip down, how many of you have group tables? You inherited them maybe in your classroom. That's a holdover from the progressive. Everybody's got to sit in this little cooperative group and work together. I saw an interesting thing. I'm going to use Plano as an example. This was very interesting. So you had a teacher who really was she got it. So she has these tables, and these 2nd graders are all sitting around the tables, you know. But she had them make a privacy folder and put it on. You know, so they could work individually, you know. She got it, but she was stuck with those group things and had to work that way. Let's go a little bit onto the curriculum now. I don't think I need to talk about the 7 liberal arts. We know the difference between, you know, and it's not that we don't teach the sciences and the STEM, it's just that is not the focus. It's only a part of the liberal arts, you know. The quadrivium would be part of our liberal arts. But in progressive schools, you're going to see a real strong emphasis on the STEM and the science and such. And by the way, when progressive educators talk about science, you know, they use that term science, we immediately get this idea that, well, they're talking about biology, or they're talking about astronomy, or one of these subject areas of science. That's really not where that word comes from. What they mean by that is experimentation, okay? Well, this is scientific. That means that we've done this experimentation on the kids and we're keeping lots of records on the kids and data. That's kind of where that word science comes from when we hear progressive educators talk about that. So be careful with these definitions. Like Dewey was very good at switching definitions of words. Progressive educators do that, and we should be very clear about what we mean in our definitions of words. The self-esteem movement is all part of progressivism, and it's kind of gone out of vogue, but it was huge about 10, 15 years ago, and it was the idea that every child, we've got to honor every child, no matter what, everyone gets a ribbon type of thing. I don't know if we see that much in classical schools. That's a problem. I'll tell you this one story about this. I was taken to the school board many years ago because we had a list of objective awards that we gave at the end of the year, and they were all based on achievement. And not everybody got an award. We had the spelling bee, the track meet, that kind of stuff. But it was all, our criteria was it all has to be objectively based. It cannot be subjective things. I am not going to give Johnny an award for being the nicest boy in school or something like that. And we had a progressive family that came in and they were just horrified about that. They thought that was so terrible. It was destroying the self-esteem of these kids. We had this very tense voters meeting over it, and one of the ladies left in tears, and I'm sitting there, I was the brunt of it all, and there's long silence, very thick, you could cut it with a knife, and then one of our board members said, "We're not giving any Holy Joe awards out at this school." So, that's very common, I think, in maybe Reformed schools, where Christian behavior, it's very subjective, is a mark of faith, more or less, so we will honor you as being nicer than someone else or being more cooperative, very, very subjective type awards. And I would challenge you to look at your awards that you give to the students. If you want to motivate them, base it on objective achievement. Don't base it on some subjective opinion you have of the child and their personality. Does that make sense to you? I've seen that our own children were in a Lutheran school, and they were getting these awards for their good citizenship and things like that. Christian citizenship, I should say. Very subjective, and, the kids and the parents say, "Hey, are you kidding me? I know that kid. That's, we're all sinners," and these kind of things come out. Move down the list to the teachers and the bureaucrats choose the curriculum. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the curriculum and the accreditation and stuff tomorrow, so we'll skip that one. Actually, progressive education would say that the students choose the curriculum based on their personal interests. That should guide what you do. What we were taught at Seward was, though, that the teacher must choose the curriculum. And you don't see that in public schools. They don't have a whole lot of authority over the curriculum. The government, the state, whatever, chooses the curriculum. But in Lutheran education, there's this idea that the teachers are still their little authority in their classroom, and they decide what they're going to teach. There's not any kind of an outside authority like a board or anything that would just tell them what they need to teach. And I think that's something we need to rethink. We need to really rethink that. Our teachers as professionals, and if you have experts in the field, should be part of a curriculum committee that decides and lists out, maps out what you're going to be teaching, K through 12. And someone mentioned this the other day, you start with 12 and you go backwards. You don't start with 1 and go forward. I don't remember who said that. That's a very good point. But it needs to be school-wide and not just the people in the classroom. You also have administrators, pastors need to have input in this and such. So again, that's a point of another session. And maybe some of you don't agree with me on that, but that is one thing that I do see a lot of. This idea that, as parents or as administrators, you have no right to say what we're going to teach in the classroom. And that's just a wrong attitude. And yes, there was a question there. Yes, sir.
I wonder if that has to do with our same practice, though, using the same verbiage for teachers and pastors. Like we call a teacher, and a pastor doesn't work for the Board of Elders, he works for God. And the teacher get that same mentality, where that's not the case.
Thank you. That is a really good point, and I think we are still struggling with these Office of the Ministry issues as to, who's really a minister and what their role is and such. I think it's not as bad as it was 15 years ago in the church, but we still have lingering problems with that whole idea of who's accountable to who and so on. Thank you for that. Languages, progressive education would totally scorn Latin, and we would say, yes, we need to learn the theological languages, we need to learn the classical languages, and modern languages that apply too. My husband says we're almost done, so I want to just point out one thing. I've got formalist versus content-rich there on the chart. What I mean by formalist is progressive education defines their goals of education almost entirely in terms of process, strategies, how you're going to do things, not what you're going to teach, okay? The radical progressive educators and the postmodern educators, they would say, oh yeah, we use content, but they would use the content as a vehicle to teach attitudes and behaviors such as community activism and things like that. So that you might be kind of buffaloed by talking with, for example, a public educator, and they say, well, yeah, we teach about ancient history, what's so different about you guys? Well, it's a totally different way of learning, understanding the curriculum. We would say that our kids are learning facts. They are learning about these cultures. They are learning about history. They would say, we're just using this as a vehicle to teach our belief system or our attitude or our certain behavior that we want these children to acquire. I'm going to stop here. You can read the rest of them. Tomorrow what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what I think are some issues that really need to be talked about and they aren't, challenges that we have in our Lutheran classical schools and impediments that we have to achieving them, and talk a little bit about the characteristics of a successful school. So anybody have any questions? I know it's probably, a lot of this may be obvious, really. Yes, sir.
I know you'll talk more about this, but the whole question of teacher accountability and autonomy, it seems to me that we do want teachers in our classrooms, classical classrooms, to be experts and to a certain extent autonomous. I think the question, in my mind, is not a lack of accountability, but to whom they're accountable.
Thank you. Yes, that's a better way of putting it. Yes.
In the progressive system, it's to the state and to the school boards outside of the families and the school. For a classical school, they are accountable to one another and to the school board within the school, as well as to the families. It's to whom they're accountable.
Thank you. Yes, that's a much better clarification of it. Absolutely. Yes. Did everybody hear that, what he said? Okay. The pastor?
Isn't it Gene Beat that says the curriculum is the curriculum?
It's both, I think. And yes, it is the curriculum, the grammar.
Sometimes when we talk about curriculum, we tend to think about the textbooks and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that has to be clarified sometimes in how we talk, because if we're talking curriculum, meaning Saxon, et cetera, that's a different attitude than Trivium, where they have goals of what we want to teach with the materials that we use. So that distinction, I think, has to be clarified.
Thank you. The textbooks are tools, aren't they? They are tools that we use to teach our curriculum. Okay. See you tomorrow. Thank you.